Sometimes you just have to let your league mates draft a player instead. Look, it doesn't mean that player's bad or even a bust for fantasy. It just means they're going a tad too early. Because reaching on players, especially early on in drafts, isn't the best strategy. So here's the top 10 players in ranking order to let your league mates draft in 2023. And it's going to start with Jaylen Waddle. Like I said, some of these are going to be fantastic real life players. And that's what Waddle has been in real life and fantasy. He's been a top 15 receiver his first 2 years in the league. And in 2022, he led the entire NFL in yards per target and yards per reception. His role evolved. He was being used more downfield. But since he's in this video, of course, there's an issue. And it starts with the fact that Waddle in drafts currently goes on average as the 11th wide receiver off the board, a place he's never finished before. Look, he's being drafted at his ceiling because, reminder, he still has to compete with Tyreek Hill for targets in Miami. And Tyreek Hill last year was the most efficient wide receiver in the entire NFL. He averaged 3.38 yards per route run, 10% better than any other receiver. So simply put, this means Waddle is still the clear number 2 receiver and number 2 option in this offense behind Tyreek. And based on where he's going in fantasy drafts, he'd have to finish as a top 10 wide receiver to pay off his current price, which seems difficult for him to do because he led the league in yards per catch last year and still didn't finish top 10. And the other issue is his quarterback has had a lot of concussions, and if something happens to Tua, this could all fall apart. And concussions are very fickle. One more and he could be done for maybe the entire year. He was cleared, as you can see here, from Ian Rappaport in February. He'll be 100% when the time football comes, but let's talk about that. Because you're really never 100% from concussions. This is from somebody who had a concussion that lasted over a year. It just takes one hit, especially since Tua's was just months ago, for it to all start back up again. And it's worth noting that last year Tua sustained 2 reported concussions, but as we all saw on national TV, it was probably really 3 actual concussions last year in about a 3-month span. So if anybody ever says that Tua is 100%, he's ready to go this year, no, it just takes one hit and he could be done for a while. So you get a player in Jaylen Waddle who's being drafted at his ceiling. I'd just rather have guys that go around him. Definitely Amon-Ra St. Brown, and guys that go after him like DK Metcalf and Chris Olave. So now let's move from Waddle to a running back that you need to be aware of. And that man's name is Jonathan Taylor, the number 1 overall player in fantasy at the running back position just 2 years ago. And despite a down year last year, he's still going as a top 5 fantasy running back right now, ahead of Nick Chubb. Now let's talk more about those production woes last year. He was the 17th overall running back in fantasy points per game before he sustained an injury. And this year his outlook is much worse because the Colts drafted Anthony Richardson with the 4th overall pick in the NFL draft. Richardson is a mobile quarterback. And pay attention to this. These are the targets for running backs last year at Florida when Richardson was the quarterback. The most targets to a running back was 14 total targets. Richardson only targeted running backs on 5% of his throws, which is 60 to 70% less than the average quarterback. And that's what we see with mobile quarterbacks. They check it down less often. And this is Florida's rushing yards last year. You can see that Richardson accounted for 654, nearly 30% of their total rushing yards and over 30% of their rushing TDs. He just steals productions from running backs. Look, all of this is a major issue because it destroys the floor and definitely the upside of Jonathan Taylor, who again goes as a top 5 back. He needs that upside because Taylor averaged 16 touchdowns and 38 catches in his first 2 seasons as a top 10 running back. And these totals are just not likely with Richardson at quarterback, but it doesn't stop there. Because last year the Colts offensive line dropped. Usually they're a top 5 unit, but Quinton Johnson had a bad year and the Colts ranked 13th in run blocking last year, a 21% drop from the previous year, which led to some of the efficiency drops from Jonathan Taylor, who was 30th on the ground as a rusher and 37th. He was the 37th best running back in yards per touch. That's alarming. So instead of taking Taylor, go ahead and take Nick Chubb for sure, and even Saquon Barkley, just check his status with a potential holdout. And that takes us to the number 8 player that you should allow your friends to draft instead. We go to another running back, the new Philadelphia Eagle, and this would be Deandre Swift. When Swift was traded, he ended up going as the 22nd overall player, and now he's still going that high. He's going 23rd overall ahead of guys like David Montgomery. And this is far too early because we know that the Eagles head coach Nick Sirianni from his time with Philadelphia and the Colts likes to use multiple running backs. I mean, just check this out. This is Miles Sanders' snap share from last year. 58% of the snaps as the number 1 running back on the Eagles, ranked 20th in the NFL. But that's not all, because now Swift goes to a team where he has to deal with a mobile quarterback in Jalen Hurts. And Hurts is potentially the best mobile quarterback. You can see right here, he was 2nd in the entire NFL, including every single running back, in touches inside the 5-yard line. He had 20 goal line touches last year. Only Jamal Williams had more. So that steals work from your running backs. And like we mentioned with Anthony Richardson being a mobile quarterback, he doesn't check it down as much. The Eagles running backs last year with Hurts ranked dead last in receptions. And this is the exact breakdown of that. You had Gainwell seeing the most catches last year at the position for the Eagles with just 23. And now these 48 receptions are what Swift did last year in a potential down year for his receptions. He was top 12, and if he only got 23 this year, like the Eagles leader had last year, that would be a 52% drop. So this is a major downgrade in many ways because his fantasy production has been built off the receiving game. And now I know what you might be thinking. Oh, Sal, but Miles Sanders last year, as you can see on the screen right here, he had over 1,300 total yards. Yeah, well, despite having over 1,300 total yards and 11 rushing touchdowns, he was still just 21st in fantasy points per game with 12.7. So as good of a year as you can have, but because the receiving work wasn't there, outside the top 20. So when you're hovering around this point in the draft, if you need a running back, just target guys like Rashad White, even James Conner, David Montgomery. You could keep scrolling. Alvin Kamara on this list. They're all better options than Swift. So that was the number 8 player to let your friends draft. Now let's move to number 7, a rookie. And that would be Devonta Chains, the new Miami Dolphin. Chains was taken in the 3rd round. It was actually the Dolphins' 2nd overall pick. They didn't have a 1st round pick out of Texas A&M. And this dude is an elite prospect. He has top 1% speed of all time. He averaged 130 yards per game last year, and he was 5th in broken tackles. But he's in this video, so he has some major concerns. For starters, he's 5'8" and just 188 pounds, and there's an extremely poor track record of running backs this size in the NFL. But luckily for Chain, he landed in the perfect spot with Mike McDaniels, whose offenses thrive off speed. I mean, a guy like Raheem Mostert has had many top 10 weeks in this Mike McDaniel system. Mostert is a fast running back, and Chain's even faster. You could see some of the career finishes for Mostert, who again has always dealt with injuries, so some of this is skewed. 30th, 26th, and 29th at the running back position is solid, especially when you consider that Devonta Chains is currently going as the 39th running back. If he has that type of production as a younger and faster back than Mostert, well, he'll actually pay off his ADP. But it's not that easy because there's more issues. For starters, last year on November 1st, Jeff Wilson was traded to Miami, and he ended up becoming their RB1 immediately. Because in 6 healthy games with Miami, Wilson averaged 22.3 points on 19 touches. He was a top 10 running back, really top 5 running back during this stretch, and that's not all. Because as we scroll through the games that he played healthy for Miami, he had 3 red zone touches, 3 red zone touches, 4 red zone touches. You keep scrolling, 2 red zone touches, 2 red zone touches. He was the main red zone back, which hurts Devonta Chains. And not just Wilson, but also his own size doesn't bode well for red zone touches, and we have even more concerns. Because the Dolphins have tried to trade for Dalvin Cook and currently have a contract on the table for him should he want to sign it, which would be where he's from in Florida. So Chain's unlikely to get red zone work and have to split other touches with 2 to maybe even 3 running backs if Dalvin Cook is there. Just avoid him in this range and then avoid the number 6 guy to let your league mates draft instead. And that would be Travis Etienne, who goes way earlier than some of the guys that we've been talking about like Devonta Chains. Because Etienne is currently going as the 14th running back off the board, ahead of guys like Aaron Jones and Joe Mixon, and this is just a mistake. Look, plain and simple, Etienne has receiving game concerns, and this is reflected in how he was used last year. A lot of people think he's a good receiver from his final year at Clemson in college, and a lot of that was schemed work, and he didn't have to do much after the catch. He was just 22nd in running back targets last year, but more importantly, Etienne was 27th in running back route participation. He only was used on 40% of the Jaguars' passing plays. And now he has some actual competition, because in the 3rd round of the draft, the Jaguars took Tank Bigsby out of Auburn. And Bigsby caught passes in college. He earned targets. Look at this. His college target share, 15.3% of Auburn's targets, is 94th percentile of all time. That means top 6% of all time. So he knows how to earn targets, and he's been impressing the Jacksonville staff already. This quote states that Bigsby already impressed the Jaguars players and staff members with his playmaking ability in the passing game. And here's some even more positive news. This is the type of back we wanted to bring to the table. He fit everything that we were looking for. He popped off the screen. You can continue to read there basically everything he was doing right, and they were mesmerized by it. Now, one more thing in terms of why Etienne is somebody you need to avoid. Let your friends take him. Last year, the Jaguars ranked just 30th in run blocking. They had a poor offensive line, and it's not going to get any better because they just lost Jawan Taylor, who was arguably their best offensive lineman last year. He is now a Kansas City Chief. So in this range of running backs where Etienne goes, I definitely want Joe Mixon and Aaron Jones, and you can keep scrolling. I would even take guys like Cam Akers over him. All right, now we head to the top 5 players to let your dumb friends take instead. And like I mentioned at the top, it's more talented and great players, the rookie in Seattle, Jackson Smith-Njigba. And the man who goes by the nickname JSN, his initials, he was taken in the 1st round of the draft, the 20th overall pick out of Ohio State by Seattle. And this dude was fantastic at Ohio State. Take a look. In his last full year, he had 95 catches for over 1,600 yards, and he did this while playing next to both Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, who now are like superstars in the NFL already. Both of those stud receivers have already said that he was the best player at Ohio State when they played this. So just think about those expectations coming into the NFL now. But the issue is he's the number 3 wide receiver on his team because DK Metcalf is number 2 in cheat code targets since 2020, his red zone targets and downfield targets. And then there's Tyler Lockett, who just saw career high efficiency last year. Last year was arguably the best year of his career. And you can see this broken broken down more in a tweet from Matt Harmon from Reception Perception. It's a site that he has. It's fantastic. Look, he had a 79% success rate, Tyler Lockett, last year against man coverage. This was a career best, top 4%, 96th percentile of all time. Basically, the translation there is he had the best year of his career at getting open. Now, despite this competition, Jackson Smith-Njigba still goes right now in round 7. He's often taken ahead of guys like Marquise Brown, Kadarius Toney, even Jahan Dotson, which is strange because some of those guys like Toney and Hollywood Brown are going to be the #1 receivers on their team. So your takeaway is JSN is a great player. He'll be great in Dynasty and in future years, but for this year, stay away from him and this next guy who might upset some of you. And yes, it is Bijan Robinson, who I will say is a trap in fantasy football, because right now he goes off the board as a top 4 running back. You can see right here after Saquon Barkley, and often now it's Saquon's, just as we're recording this, potential contract issues, I'm seeing Bijan go as a top 3 running back off the board. Now look, Bijan Robinson is great. I got to watch him firsthand at the University of Texas. He is a phenomenal player. This has nothing to do with that. He led college football in broken tackles last year and earned nearly 160 yards per game. But the issue is he's being drafted at his ceiling. He'll have to finish as a top 2 running back to pay off his price tag in fantasy. And this is just unlikely for an offense that is led by Desmond Ridder, because you're going to need to score a lot of touchdowns to do that. Do we trust Ridder to get in the red zone often? And Ridder only targeted running backs in his college career plus last year just 7% of the time, well below average. And I know Bijan was taken with a top 10 pick, but there's still Cordero Patterson on the team who averaged over 5 yards per touch last year, and Tyler Algier, who broke the 12th most tackles and rushed for over 1,000 yards. I fully expect Bijan to be great. Heck, I think he'll finish as a top 10 running back. He just goes a tad too early for me in round 1. So when you're in round 1 and you're looking for a running back, just take Nick Chubb instead of him, or Saquon. Buy the dip on Saquon with some of these contract disputes. All right, now we're about to head into the top 3 players to just let your friends draft this year in fantasy. But before we get there, I must ask you, do you want to actually win your fantasy league? Probably. If you're watching this video, well, then the fantasy blueprint is for you. It's going to have all the tools you need to do just that, like our top 255 rankings right here. As you can see, Bijan Robinson, a player we talked about, I'm not that far off on him. He goes as a top 10 player overall right now. I have him as my 13th overall player. He goes just a tad too early. Now, getting your blueprint for 2023 is simple. You just click the link in the description below or scan the QR code on the screen. And the blueprint is only $5, not just to help you with the draft, but every single week of the year up until your fantasy championship. And here's the deal. If you don't make your fantasy playoffs for some reason, I'll just refund that $5, making this 100% risk-free. So to get your fantasy blueprint and join the thousands of others who already have access to it, just click the link in the description or scan that QR code on the screen. And now to the top 3 players to let your friends draft instead. We start with Michael Pittman, the Colts wide receiver. You want to avoid him because look, last year Pittman saw his efficiency drop by 26%. He only averaged 1.57 yards per route run. That was 53rd amongst all receivers, and now his situation is going to get worse. Because like we mentioned earlier for Jonathan Taylor, the Colts drafted Anthony Richardson in round 1. And more specifically, Richardson last year, his 654 rushing yards, that breaks down to 55 rushing yards per game in 2022, which means that's less targets and less passes overall going to your wide receivers. And this is a ranking of the quarterbacks last year in college football and their accuracy. Look at the name above my head. 144th in accuracy last year was Anthony Richardson, completing just 54% of his passes, which is an issue because it leads to even more harm for the catchable targets for Michael Pittman. Mobile QBs harm their wide receivers' upside because they run more in the red zone and lead to below average passing volume. Now, one more thing on Pittman. Last year, he saw a lot of accurate targets from Matt Ryan and the guys who filled in. 85% of his targets were catchable. That was 11th amongst all receivers. That's pretty rare. But despite that accurate volume, he still finished 23rd in points per game and now is getting a really inaccurate QB. So just let your friends take Pittman and the number 2 guy on this list. And that would be the rookie in LA in Quinton Johnson. The Chargers took Johnson with their first overall pick, the 22nd pick in the draft. He's out of TCU. And Johnson was top 10 in broken tackle rate last year. All right, here's what you need to know. Last year, Quinton Johnson had his best year as a college receiver, 60 catches, over 1,000 yards in an offense that didn't throw the ball all that much. He was the clear alpha, and he's great after the catch. But he has one major concern. His route running and ability to separate is not NFL ready. And not only that, but now he's joining a loaded and proven wide receiver room. You have Keenan Allen, who was still efficient despite being 31 now. He was 13th in wide receiver efficiency last year. And Mike Williams, who's been a top 20 fantasy receiver in back-to-back years. And I'll also call out that Jalen Guyton is still on the field. Look, he's not somebody that you know name value-wise, but he's a guy that they put out there a lot for deep plays, which is his own role, and that's just going to take more snaps away from the rookie Quinton Johnson. Look, Johnson only played 7% of his snaps in college from the slot. He's predominantly an outside receiver, which means he'll come off the field in 2 wide receiver sets. Keenan Allen and Mike Williams will stay on the field. Now, this is concerning because it means Quinton Johnson isn't going to be a full-time player. And despite this, in fantasy, he goes on average in round 9 ahead of Rashad Bateman, who might be the #1 receiver on his team, and Rondale Moore, who was breaking out last year and will definitely be a top 2 option on his team. So pass on the rookie Quinton Johnson and then pass on the number 1 player that you need to let your friends, your dumb friends, draft instead. And that man's name is the Denver Broncos running back Javonte Williams. Javonte currently goes off the board as the running back 27, ahead of guys like AJ Dillon and Alexander Madison. You could see more names here if we keep scrolling, like Alvin Kamara, just guys that he shouldn't be going ahead of. And he's likely only going to continue to rise towards the top 20 running backs because it was recently announced that Javonte is not going to start training camp on the physically unable to perform list, the PUP, which means that he's trending towards being active for week 1. Now, in theory, this is great news and he should rise, but it's more complicated than that. My guess is that he'll jump into the top 20 running backs, around the top 15 to 20. He'll go next to guys like Miles Sanders, Aaron Jones, Joe Mixon, and he's just a tier below this in my opinion. Because reminder, he is coming off of a major knee surgery and he's not going to be 100% week 1. And more specifically, on October 2nd last year, he ended up tearing his ACL, his LCL, and his PLC. So this was just 3 different injuries in one. It's normally over a year recovery, up to maybe even 15 months. And if it was on the lower end for a year recovery, this would put him not being 100% for at least a month of the season. But multiple doctors on Twitter who have been on different sides of this. Jeff Mueller has been pro that Javonte will play week 1, but even him, if we were to scroll down here, he says Javonte will be playing week 1. I just don't think he'll be 100% early. And if you look down a little bit more, he says he projects him to be startable in fantasy by week 8. So for the first 7 weeks or so, you're not going to have a startable player, but though you have to take him as a top 30 running back. And then there's Sports MD Analysis on Twitter, who has basically stated that it's promising news that he's going to miss the PUP list, but still the data is projecting at least 3 to 4 games for him to ramp up in week 8 or after until it's starting to look promising for Javonte. The translation here is that Javonte is not going to be 100% healthy until maybe mid-season. And this is similar, as you can see here from Sports MD Analysis, to what we saw from J.K. Dobbins last year. It's a similar injury. J.K. Dobbins had some more scarring, so maybe a little bit more severe than Javonte, depending on the details. We don't really have those for Javonte right now, but it took J.K. Dobbins 13 months, and he was said to have been ahead of schedule. And it really wasn't ahead of schedule for Dobbins as much as maybe the team just rushed him back and Dobbins himself really wanted to get out there, which makes sense for a player wanting to get on the field. The concerning thing is that we're seeing similar things out of Javonte in the Broncos organization this year, and last year for J.K. Dobbins, this didn't end well. Because Dobbins ended up missing about 7 total games last year. He missed a couple of weeks to start the season, and then he re-injured that knee and had to miss even more games. He missed 7 of his possible 17 games last year because he probably came back just a bit too early. So here's your simple takeaway. Don't draft players who are already injured. So these are the top 10 players that you should just let your league mates take instead. Now, if you want to see 7 players who go after round 10, the hidden gems in fantasy, well, check out this video right over here. And a reminder to subscribe to this channel because we're in the heart of the fantasy season. So if you want to smack around your buddies this year and stay one step ahead of them, be sure to hit the subscribe button.